Welcome to Lecture 11. In many ways, it's a continuation of Lecture 10. 10 introduced to you religious reforms inspiring people to believe in the perfection of their society. The reformers in this lecture are trying to perfect society, but also in the process of doing so, grant new rights. And those rights would be for women and African Americans. Let's start first with the story of women's rights. To understand what women are struggling against in the 1830s, we have to look at a new development in how women are treated in the period of Jackson and his successors. And this development is known as the cult of domesticity. After the Revolution, there's Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood lasts until about 1820 or so, but as the revivals heat up, as the Second Great Awakening intensifies, there's this emerging new idea that a woman should be defined in a very specific way. And much of this cult of true womanhood is going to be in the middle class. In the 1820s. So middle-class women, influenced by revivals, are going to talk about how women belong in the private sphere. And they're going to say God ordained women to be in the home, that God wants women to be in the household. It's the private world where women are supposed to be. Women are supposed to raise godly children. And this is even going to push against Republican motherhood and say that women don't even need an education. Godly children, well, all you need to be able to do is read the Bible for that. So you don't need to even understand politics or social developments. So godly children can come just by mom reading the Bible to the kids. She doesn't even need an education anymore. The other emphasis is that women who step outside these boundaries into the public, into the world of men, are desexing themselves. Women who get into politics lose their femininity. They lose what makes them distinctively women. So this whole move of the cult of true womanhood is going to trap women in the middle class home that's being created during the market revolution. Ironically, at the same time as that this movement arises, women are in fact engaging in political activity outside the home through the church. For example, women involved in charity work were often involved in helping the poor members of their communities, raising money to help, children without parents. So these women actually were involved in reform movements as an extension of their Christian duty. Now, very often, they would have a man oversee their efforts. So you might have a circle of ladies at the local church taking up charity, contributions to help the poor and the fallen. But a man might, watch over their efforts. He might keep records for them. He might act as their liaison to the public. But increasingly, women are going to take this role of reforming and saving the world for Jesus into the task of anti-slavery, where they see themselves as heroically rescuing slaves from the horrible mistreatment that they are experiencing that is a not Christian treatment at all. Here's the ideal home of the 1830s. The man sitting reading about politics because, that's his sphere of life. So he's got the Gazette. His son holds a square, so mathematics are in his future. Maybe he's going to be a surveyor and build houses one day. Who knows? Meanwhile, Mom has to sit with a copy of the Bible, and daughter just plays with toys that are symbolizing her future role as not an intellectual. She's not going to need mathematics. She just needs to read the scripture, and that's good enough. The key values of this home are piety, praying to God, purity, avoiding sinful behaviors, submissiveness. The New Testament talks about women submitting themselves to their husbands. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. And domesticity, taking care of the home. These four values are supposed to be the ideal wife and mother. So goodbye, Republican motherhood. Hello, being trapped in the home. By 1848, women had had enough of this submission, enough of this emphasis of their homebound role, and they formed in Seneca Falls, New York, a convention of women's rights activists. Men were present, but women largely led the meeting. This is not the first sort of call for women's rights. There are actually earlier discussions as well, but Seneca Falls is sort of a key turning point in women's rights. They gathered to declare their independence from men and their independent sentiments. So when they write their declaration, they literally copy the Declaration of Independence. So Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are the sort of leading voices at this convention. And what they agree on is that women should have the right to public respect, the right to an education, the right to control what goes on in their family, the right to own property apart from their husbands, the right to be seen as every bit the intellectual equal as man. And then very narrowly, was controversial at the time, they did approve that women should have the right of suffrage, borrowing from the idea that women are, not represented in their government, so they don't have a voice in politics, and that makes them, slaves to men. That makes them slaves to their society, and they certainly believe they deserve better. Here is the opening of the Seneca Falls Declaration. You notice the copying of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So women are claiming natural rights, just like the American revolutionaries did. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So they go on and on, and they accuse men of being tyrants. Such has been the patient sufferance of the women under this government, and is now the necessity which constrains them to demand the equal station to which they are entitled. Here is the kicker. Here's the mic drop sentence. The history of mankind is the history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Boom! Now, the ladies who did this, you might be thinking, what led them to be so in your face, demanding equality, demanding rights? Many of them come from Quaker backgrounds. They have supportive husbands sometimes. Their husbands aren't always supportive. Many of these women are religious, deeply, deeply religious, and involved in church. But what they see is a world, even in church, dominated by men. And this pushes them at one point to actually rewrite the Bible to be a sort of proto-women's Bible rather than the Bible from a man's point of view. And when they debate men and men quote Scripture, women will often reply that the Scripture is being misinterpreted to support the patriarchy. So these are women who are not having any of the traditional arguments for their subservience to men. Men are not going to be widely accepting of this Seneca Falls Convention. And this cartoonist suggests that women, if given these rights of equality, would simply take off into the public sphere. They'd be driving carriages by themselves. Oh my goodness, women drivers. Leaving men at home to do the washing. Oh no. And men to take care of the kids. Oh no. Here are the two pictures illustrating the leading ladies of this movement, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony. By the way, most of them will live all the way toward the end of the 19th century. So they will be around quite some time to watch the battle for women's rights unfold. Now, many of these women were also not just thinking about their own rights, but thinking about the rights of enslaved women. This image, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" was designed to emphasize that much of the women's rights movement was also directed at helping their enslaved sisters get out of the tyranny of slaveholders. So in many ways, women see their freedom and their equality linked to freedom for African Americans. They see it as parallel struggles. And that leads us now to the anti-slavery movement. Before 1830, anti-slavery was largely confined to discussions about moving African Americans out of the United States. There was a colonization movement widely supported by even African Americans, designed around creating a colony for African Americans in Africa. And the driving force behind this colonization movement was the deep worry that soon America would have too many free blacks. And what would we do as a country? Where would they go? How would they be involved in society? So colonization really focuses on the idea of, what happens in the future when slavery is gone? And many white Americans just don't see a future that includes African Americans living side by white people. So this recolonization of blacks in Africa resulted in the creation of a colony, Liberia. That's not the only colony in Africa. There's a British colony as well. And many of the early African American abolitionists are interested in sending their brothers and sisters to Africa to try to colonize and build a new life there. About 1828, 29, 30, in those 3 years, abolition or anti-slavery takes a very radical direction. And it takes a radical direction because of African Americans like David Walker. Walker was a free black man from North Carolina who moved to the North and wrote an appeal to the colored citizens of the world in 1829, calling for universal immediate emancipation, end slavery now, everywhere, and he even praised violence, saying that if slaves had to take their masters' lives to get free, well, so be it. Walker and others pushed white abolitionists toward the radical position of an immediate end to slavery. And the leading voice in this movement is a guy named William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison founded an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator in 1831, which called for immediate, like right now, uncompensated, meaning no money, emancipation. So his argument is really based in the Second Great Awakening. Garrison's a deeply religious man, and he says slavery is a national evil. If it's a national evil, it should be eliminated immediately, and no one should be paid for it, because you don't pay people to stop sinful behaviors. Garrison explicitly rejected colonization, saying that colonization was racist. There was no reason at all to have colonies for African Americans, because African Americans lived in the United States and they deserve to be free here. By 1832, Garrison and others had formed the American Anti-Slavery Society to call for an end to slavery, and their chief weapon was moral suasion. That is, they persuade slaveholders to give up their slaves voluntarily. Now, before you reject this idea, consider Garrison and others like him are deeply religious. They believe slavery is a sin. You can't make people stop sinning. They have to change their own hearts and give up their sinful behavior. So the AASS wants slave owners to voluntarily give up slavery. Here's the title page of Walker's Appeal, with a brief sketch of his life, published by another abolitionist, Henry Highland Garnet. So the masthead of William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. Notice here it pictures a slave sale, because Garrison did not play around with his language. He did not sugarcoat. He did not tiptoe carefully around the feelings of Southerners. He hit them square in the face with the horribleness of slavery, emphasizing such things as women and children being sold and separated, all for Southerners to make money. Garrison's agitation really sparked an enormous political outcry from Southerners and even Northerners. And it's because the abolitionists were actually a minority group. There are probably no more than 10,000 abolitionists total in the 30 years before the Civil War. No more than 10,000 people in the North who completely believe in the radical abolition of slavery. So abolitionists are actually frowned upon, they're hated, and they're disliked, even in the North. The reason that abolitionists aroused so much dislike is because in 1835, they mailed 175,000 letters to Southerners, direct address letters to Southerners, saying, "Dear Southern so-and-so, get rid of your slaves. Slavery is a sin. You are engaging in sin. This is wrong." These letters so offended Southerners that President Jackson gave permission to postmasters to basically not deliver them. In Charleston, the postmaster basically said, I am leaving the post office unlocked. I'm going on break. And a mob broke in, not really broke in, but, pretended to. They took the letters and they burned them publicly because this was so offensive to Southerners that they were being accused of sinful behavior. Abolitionists started demanding an end to the selling of slaves in Washington, D.C. because, how awkward is that to go to our nation's capital, the land of the free, the home of the brave, and seeing a mother and a child being sold on the, corner right around from Congress. They also petitioned against the annexation of new slave states, saying the U.S. did not need any more states that would be pro-slavery. And their target at first was Texas, which was the newest potential state. And they were quite successful. Texas was not admitted to the Union for 10 years. This flurry of petition activity and agitation caused Congress to have to sit down and decide how they're going to respond. According to the First Amendment, people have the right to petition their government, right to complain and say, here's a problem, fix it. But Southerners are so upset by these petitions that they actually pushed through Congress a gag rule. A rule saying Congress will not read the petitions, which kind of raises the question, what good is your right to petition if Congress won't even read it? Do you even have a right if Congress refuses to read what you're asking? So abolitionists would write these petitions, send them to Congress, and Congress would literally let them lay on the table. That's the phrase in the journals. They're not supposed to be read out loud. They're not supposed to be referred to. They're not supposed to, pay any attention to them. Basically, the Congress is saying, we're going to ignore that you're even petitioning us. Here's an illustration of the Southerners breaking into the Charleston post office to steal abolitionist letters and to burn them. And here is some data on the rise of abolitionist societies. In 1833, there are 47 abolitionist societies in the United States. In 1836, 526 societies. So 3 years later, that's a pretty massive increase. And by 1839, 1,300 abolitionist societies, groups of people calling for abolition. Let's look at petition signatures, because this is an interesting illustration as well. In 1836, 34,000 people signed abolitionist petitions. 37, that's 110,000. 38, 300,000. 1840, 500,000 people are signing these petitions. We can even compare this by state to show you exactly where people are in states. So the largest number of societies is actually going to be in Ohio. Is that surprising? Ohio is a sort of hotbed of anti-slavery activity, which means also Ohio's a hotbed of political conflict over abolitionists. Then it's New York, 103, Massachusetts with 88. In other words, you're going to find abolitionist and anti-slavery societies largely in the North. Interestingly enough, we've mapped out who signs the petitions, and it turns out that of the total signers in 1837 to 38, 67% of them are women. Are you surprised that women would find common cause with the plight of slaves, with the lives of slaves? Is it surprising that women would say, gosh, I understand what it's like to be under the hand of a tyrant? Kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? Why women would get involved in anti-slavery. It seems so obvious now. In fact, here is a petition from Licking County, Ohio, with the daughters and wives of the country pleading to Congress to do something about limiting the sale of slaves in the District of Columbia. And here are the names of the ladies: Anna Bancroft, Wright, Eliza Adams, Hannah Little. All these people, Rachel Fairley. Chances are good that if your family has been in Ohio for a long time, one of your female ancestors' names might be on one of these petitions. Now, I would be a terrible historian if I let you think that anti-slavery is the work of white Northern women and white abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, because that ignores the work done by slaves themselves to get their freedom. Many Southern slaves are looking for ways to escape, whether that's through rebelling or just simply running away. And their actions are going to raise the stakes of the abolitionists. Every time an abolitionist says something about ending slavery, and then a slave runs away, it's going to make Southerners even angrier and blame abolitionists even more. So Southerners end up becoming far more conspiratorial in their thinking. They are starting to think all Northerners want to destroy slavery and want to undermine Southern way of life. They're suspicious of their own slaves. What if my slaves are plotting against me? Which of my slaves is thinking he might run away? So there's a lot of suspicion-based thinking, conspiratorial thinking that's really ramping up in the 1830s on the way to the Civil War, almost to the point of Southerners becoming full-on paranoid about the future of slavery. The most dramatic of the revolts is Nat Turner's revolt in 1831. Turner was a lay Baptist preacher in Virginia who had access to literacy, access to, the ability to preach to other slaves. He even baptized a white man at one point. Turner gets visions that, God wants to bring an end to slavery, and he sees the heavens filled with blood. He launches a revolt with his conspirators, and in the dead of night, they murder 55 white people in their sleep, men, women, and children. It absolutely shocks Southern society. Southerners tighten their grip on slavery. They tighten up the laws regarding slavery. They blame abolitionists for causing this revolt. And they're increasingly suspicious of the North and the North's motives. When the Underground Railroad kicks into high gear as a result of abolitionist activity and slaves linking up with abolitionists, it also increases tensions between the North and the South. Between 1810 and 1850, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 100,000 slaves running away, many of them heading into Ohio, crossing the Ohio River from Kentucky, and making their way to Columbus. There was quite a network of abolitionists and Underground Railroad houses here in Columbus, and free African American communities being founded in this area. Some of them chose not to stay, but instead to keep on going north, eventually to Canada. Here is a newspaper illustration of the horrid massacre of Nat Turner in Virginia. Notice the emphasis on the slaves brutally killing white people, brutally killing men, women, and children, though most of it happened in their sleep, not in the middle of the ground somewhere outside. Southerners, in order to counteract the abolitionist portrayal of slavery as evil, started changing their ways of describing slavery. It used to be that Southerners would say slavery is a necessary evil. They didn't like it, but they needed it. It was the best way to make money. It was the best way to get the country going. And it was, after all, something they'd inherited from their, fathers and grandfathers. So might as well just use it. After 1830, Southerners started saying slavery is not an evil, it's actually good, it's positive. It is beneficial, not just for white people, but for slaves as well. And they said, first of all, slavery is biblical. You can find it in the Bible, so it's clearly there. They said slaves were not capable of freedom. You cannot free African Americans because they can't handle freedom, so slavery is good for them. They argued that slavery helped slaves, that black people were better off in the United States than they would be if you left them in Africa. In Africa, they would be savage, uncivilized, and unchristianized. At least here, they would be somewhat civilized and they'd be exposed to the gospel of Jesus. Paternalistic masters basically said slaves were their family, which is kind of odd to think about when you think about brutally whipping and torturing your family, sexually abusing your family, because, those seem like completely Christian values. So pardon me if I find this paternalistic rhetoric hypocritical. Many masters tried to convince the North and themselves that they took better care of their slaves than Northern factory owners took care of their employees. This is clearly dishonest propaganda, but it's so widespread that they believe it's true. Southerners convince themselves that it's true. And occasionally you will find someone who'll say, wasn't a Southern master good? Aren't there examples of good Southern masters? Well, yes. In the same way that your abuser might occasionally be nice to you, or that the person who's kidnapped you might feed you to keep you alive. But at the end of the day, having your freedom taken away from you and not being allowed to be the full human that you are does not justify any of what went on in slavery at all. So recognizing that some people were good just doesn't cut it. In fact, scholars have calculated that if we paid slaves for their labor that they had never been paid for, it would be several $trillion for the more than 200 million hours of unpaid work that they did to help build the United States. And that's not including paying them for all the times they were whipped, beaten, they saw their children sold, they saw their mothers, their sisters sold, or the times that they were sexually abused by their owners. So paternalism is something Southerners believe in. Is it real? Is it honest? Heck no. In the North, abolitionists were not welcomed necessarily either, because Northerners thought that the abolitionists were rabble-rousers and agitators. They thought that if abolitionists had their way, free black people would flood into the North and take jobs away from poor white people. So Northern mobs actually attack abolitionists and destroy their newspapers. Sometimes even abolitionists are killed in these attacks. Here is some paternalist pro-slavery propaganda showing the good master looking up towards the heavens, saying, these poor creatures are a sacred legacy from my ancestors, and while $1 is left me, nothing shall be spared to increase their comfort and happiness. Well, how about freeing them, you self-righteous jerk? And the slaves are all portrayed as happy and smiling. Even the elderly are taken care of. They're well-dressed. The rest are out there dancing and having a good time. And the slaves are going, God bless you, massa. You feed and clothe us. When we are sick, you nurse us. And when too old to work, you provide for us. Hogwash. The same is portrayed here. Slavery as it exists in America. Once again, happy, dancing, smiling slave. Meanwhile, let's talk about the real slavery. Factory owners abusing their employees and abusing the children that work for them. That's the real slavery, according to Southerners. Here is some interesting information about how abolitionists are treated. So the outrage of an abolitionist showing up to speak. Cincinnati, this newspaper telling people to beware of abolitionists. There's an attack on a school for colored students, an attack on an abolitionist newspaper. So the North is not exactly welcoming of abolitionists. In fact, we know that there are a number of riots in the North. The peak is 1836, when there are 64 riots over various things like abolition and other political difficulties. Notice that this is Jackson's last year as president. Here's an illustration of an anti-abolitionist mob attacking a newspaper office. In this particular case, they killed the editor of the newspaper. Another riot illustrated here, showing an African American even shooting a weapon into a crowd. And the dreadful riot on Negro Hill, where even the women are out in the streets attacking people with their brooms. What many Northerners were in fact afraid of, as well as Southerners, was possible race mixing. This is the illustration known as an amalgamation waltz, in which Northerners, as well as many Southerners, were afraid, what if African Americans pursue our daughters? Will we end up with a mixed race society? Which is a funny thing to even think about, considering how many Southern masters had raped their slaves and produced mixed race children. Politically speaking, what Northerners eventually latch onto is not the horrors of slavery, even though they agree slavery is terrible. They latch on to the idea that slavery corrupts America as a whole. It gives Southerners more political power than they deserve. Northern men resent the fact that Southerners can stop them from even discussing slavery through the gag rule. They resent the fact that the 3/5 clause gives Southerners extra votes in Congress and extra votes for president. They resent the fact that there are Northern congressmen who actually sell their souls to support Southern legislation and pro-slavery laws, in return for, of course, getting support for their own Northern legislation. This slave power is dominating and corrupting the country. So many Northerners, they may hate slavery, they may dislike the slave system, but they're actually less interested in slaves as people and more interested in the way that Southerners have used slavery to shore up their political power. How can we see this slave trade at work, slave power at work? Well, 73% of presidents were Southern. Of all the presidents up into the Civil War, most of them are Southern, and 60% of them are slave owners. So how are we going to tackle this problem? Well, moral suasion isn't going to work. It's time to get political with the Liberty Party. Yes, it's a third party. Yes, they don't really do much. But they are stirring up trouble that will bear fruit later. The Liberty Party grows out of the AASS because they say that moral suasion isn't going to work. Political action is what is needed to end slavery. So in 1840 and 1844, they ran candidates on an abolitionist platform. They were highly critical of the slave power, and they were not very popular, as you might guess, since abolitionists aren't actually all that popular either. So they dissolved by 1848. But they passed their legacy on to the Free Soil Party. Free Soilers are people who don't like slavery. They don't like the slave power. They don't like the Southerners' control over politics. But they're not exactly entirely concerned with the lives of black people. In fact, there are many racist people in the Free Soil Party who are thinking in terms of only, what's good for whites. They called for free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. Meaning free soil, no gag rule, free speech, no stifling of discussions about slavery, free labor, not slave labor, and free men. Let's have freedom be the norm for people. Now, the free soil part specifically referred to let's keep slavery out of the West, where you would have Southerners try to expand their slaves, and because they were so wealthy and so successful with their slaves, it would give them an advantage over poor white people. So the Free Soil Party doesn't care as much about actual slave people as it cares about how slavery hurts whites. Many of its folks were actually anti-black. They were pretty racist because from their point of view, it doesn't matter that slavery is harmful to black people. It's a threat to white men more than anything else. They were supported largely by the musical group known as the Hutchinsons, who wrote quite a number of emancipation and anti-slavery songs. This is the famous Get Off the Track or Roll It Along, about getting on the train for immediate emancipation. And this song was quite popular. It's not exactly easy to sing, so we're not going to sing it because it's actually pretty high.